Uh, so Matthew, I enjoyed our first conversation. Before we go to our next topic, there was one hangover question that I wanted to ask. Um, there seems to be a great need to develop mutual respect between the academic approaches in science and religion, or just in science and religion in general. And you're in a position to help mediate that. So, would you comment on that for just a few minutes? What is the posture that you would recommend for both domains, both worlds?
I think, yeah, for both scientists and for people of faith, or people who are both, the appropriate stance really is one of humility, and that's usually where we get into trouble, is when we fail to exercise appropriate humility. So we have, sometimes scientists who are experts in a particular field and very, very, very knowledgeable about that field, and they step outside of that to make comments about,
Like Dawkins.
Like Dawkins.
He's a great biologist.
Great biologist,
Yeah.
but as he goes into philosophy, and there are many examples of people who from time to time who've done that, who've stepped outside their field of expertise. And oftentimes I've run into people, there are people who kind of make the circuit around churches who kind of are self-proclaimed experts in everything scientific. And I would be the first to tell you that I am not an expert in biology. I'm not an expert in chemistry. I'm not an expert in geology. I know a little bit about those fields. I've been around, I know more about those fields now that I've hung around experts in those fields.
Yes, even though that would be the realm of the hard sciences.
Yes.
It's not necessarily true that excellence in one area translates into
Absolutely.
excellence in another area.
And there are sub-disciplines of physics and astronomy that I know very little about that I would refer you to an expert in that field. And what I do know about some of these other fields, I feel most confident about the things where I've hung around a lot of biologists or geologists who are experts in the field, and I've gleaned some knowledge from them. But there are people who have done a lot of research on their own and may not have gone through the full academic process, and have not done necessarily research or peer-reviewed publications on things, and yet they feel pretty confident about what they know, and so they present themselves as experts in particular fields. And if they're saying something that's something that you might want to hear, then it's real easy to kind of just listen to those voices. But I think, that's something not only that humility is something we not only need to exercise ourselves personally, but also we need to look for those people who are people of humility, to kind of glean information from.
Yeah, it's interesting that humility becomes foundational to the acquiring of truth.
Yes.
Whether it's hard sciences, soft sciences, any truth, humility is a component, a necessary component to insight and discernment and wisdom. Those things are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was talking about 6 months ago to Bill Phillips at a conference. He is a Nobel Prize winning physicist who is also a very devout Christian, a wonderful man. And he gave a wonderful presentation. I went up and talked to him afterwards, and I had a question for him. And when I asked the question, the first thing he said was, "Well, that's not really my area of expertise, and so I'm not sure I can give you an answer to that." And it was just a very honest question that's not something that I know the answer to. He's a very humble guy.
It's refreshing when you see that. I
Yes,
think about
it
that
is.
with Francis Collins.
Yes, another good example.
He helped unravel the human genome. And
Right.
what is the name of the website?
BioLogos is a foundation that he's a big part of.
When I've seen him interviewed, obviously he's brilliant, but I hear humility.
Yeah.
And that's very refreshing. What about from the area of faith? I mean, so a pastor writing a book on evolution, you know, and talking about the fallacies of evolution, when that's not.
Yeah, I would say the only, I would say that anyone who wants to write a book on evolution, whether supporting it or arguing against it, should rely heavily on evolutionary biologists, people who are in the field, and consult them And if you don't do that, you're probably going to be missing a lot. Just like if someone wrote a book about Christianity and didn't consult any Christians.
Yeah.
And yet, again, you'll find some people who will do that, who'll have these critiques of Christianity, and you can tell from their critique they don't even understand what Christianity is all about.
Right. I saw that one time with an interview with Karl Barth, the great German theologian, or Swiss maybe, but he was asked one time a question about anthropology, and he said, I don't know. You'll have to ask somebody in that area. That's not my area.
Yeah.
And so that humility is refreshing. So you would encourage, just sum up for us what you would encourage then as far as an approach.
Well, I encourage one where you just make sure that that you are not stepping beyond your own expertise. And even when you're talking about things in your own expertise, the humble attitude is one that's going to accomplish more in the long term. I remember that there's a verse from somewhere in Job where Job is having this discussion with his friends, and he says, "Will you argue falsely for God?" Mm. And we can have the purest of motives in the sense that we are trying to argue the case for Christianity, for God. But if we are arguing falsely, we may do more harm than good.
Yeah.
And I think that's something, it's a temptation for a lot of Christians.
Yeah.
And it's something that I know I've fallen into in the past, in my eagerness to drive home a point, which is a perfectly legitimate point.
Like when you're giving me pastoral advice.
Yeah.
Stay in your lane, Matthew.
But that's exactly. Yeah. And there's also, I think, a necessity. I would encourage people to, if you are interested in talking about these, or if you're interested in resolving some sort of internal conflict that you have about some of these topics, to try to do some due diligence in your research of understanding what these areas of science are really saying. And there's some amazing stories I know of people who were great skeptics of science, but then they were driven by the internal conflict that they had over it to do some research. And after they did some research, then it really brought them to a completely different level in not only in their understanding of science, but in their spiritual walk.
Yeah, yeah. I want to make a transition now into our second topic, and this is more kind of the meats and potatoes of science, okay, and faith. And I encourage everyone to stick with us through this discussion, because this will make sense as we go along, and these are just really foundational. When a scientist is doing their work, okay, just give us a little bit of what a scientist is doing. It is an empirical. What do we mean by that?
So the approach of science is different than a lot of other things we do in life, and there is So first, just to talk about the practical way that scientists do their work, they look at acquiring knowledge in using reasoning, inductive method. So the inductive method specifically, which is where you're building things up from basic facts and observations to develop these larger theories. So you're starting with just little bits of information that aren't necessarily important in and of themselves, and gathering this data and this information to reach a conclusion that is going to have some sort of greater meaning and application. But some key things about what scientists do that's really important and kind of distinguishes it from other, probably even more from other areas of life, even more than inductive reasoning, and that is that they rely on objective observations and evidence. And
can we insert empirical as objective?
Empirical, objective, and by what I mean by objective is that everyone who looks at the data sees the same data.
Right.
There's no disagreement about what the data point is. There may be disagreement at first of what it means, but we all see the same data.
And this is the realm of the hard sciences. The hard sciences deal with observable data, but as we move to the soft sciences, we're moving into a different realm and world that may touch on the hard sciences. But so we're dealing with empirical, observable data, and what do we do with it?
Yeah. So and when you say hard sciences, what we don't mean difficult. What hard means it's tangible, something you can really grab onto.
Right. Soft doesn't mean mushy.
Yeah.
It just means there's more subjectivity.
Right.
Okay.
In some ways, I think the softer sciences are much more difficult than the hard sciences, paradoxically.
Said by a
Yeah,
scientist.
yeah. But the hard, the sciences of biology, physics, chemistry, these are disciplines where everybody is looking at the same information. They're seeing the same thing, and so you can ask a question of, is it warm in this room? And the answer may be subjective. Yeah, it's warm. No, it's not warm. That's a subjective question, subjective answer. But if you say, is it 80 degrees in the Fahrenheit in this room, that's a very specific question with a very objective answer where you can say yes or no by looking at the temperature on a thermometer.
Right.
So that's something that distinguishes science from a lot of other disciplines and experiences, is that it is very objective. Another thing is that it relies on things that are repeatable and testable. So if you can't repeat this thing over and over again,
Right.
observation or experiment, then it's just not scientific.
Right, which is different. We can have truth like in history, Washington crossing the Delaware. Well, that's
Yeah.
not repeatable.
Right.
But that was an actual historical event.
Right.
But it's not open to the same types of examination that you would do in the hard sciences.
Right.
Okay.
There's a lot of historical events that are really beyond the purview of science. Now there are some that we have all of this data on.
Archaeology.
Yeah, and we can do all these tests.
Radiocarbon testing.
Exactly.
Right.
And so there's
pottery sherds, archaeology.
Right.
Yeah.
A lot of things that we can learn about history through objective observations, repeatable tests, but there's some things that we can't. And there's some questions that we can't answer through science. There's some truth that may be very, very true that isn't necessarily scientific truth because it's not subject to.
So an archaeologist digs up a clay widget, and he or she looks at it and goes, we can test it, we can look at the materials, we can carbon date it, what did they do with it? What did they mean by it? Mm-hmm. And that could be a hard question to answer. Is it a spindle to spin yarn, or is it a children's toy, or is it a cultic object? And we may not be able to get a scientific answer to that.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
and that's one of the big differences, and so science is really concerned with things that it's interesting that oftentimes we are very convinced naturally by anecdotal evidence. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to kind of bring that up as a real distinction between scientific approach and a non-scientific approach.
Right.
I've had people come up and bring all sorts of anecdotal evidence for something to me, and because it's evidence, they think that as a scientist I would be really convinced by.
Right.
But
should I ask your opinion of essential oils?
Yeah. So as a scientist,
you dodged that one.
when I hear anecdotal evidence, and I don't know on essential oils, but if I heard anecdotal evidence, I would say, okay, that's wonderful. It's absolutely useless.
Yes.
In terms of a scientific context. So if you have a story about a particular thing happening or something working in a certain way, and it's just an anecdotal observation, anecdotal evidence, it may be completely true, your understanding of it, but I can't analyze it scientifically.
Right.
So scientists tend to be very skeptical in their outlook, and that's great in some ways. Of course, we don't want to apply that perspective to all of life. We don't want to look at life skeptically in every way.
And let me ask you about that. So that tendency to not believe anything unless you can empirically test it does not work well historiographically or with sociology, philosophy, religion, ethics. I mean, I don't know how we test whether abortion is morally justified or morally unjustified. We can talk about percentages and numbers and how many folks had abortions, that type of thing, but we'll never answer that question with science.
Right, so there are certain questions that science is specifically not designed to answer, questions of value, of morals, of ethics, of what should or should not be done.
Right.
And so when you try to apply science to those questions, you're stepping outside of science. If you acknowledge that you're stepping outside of science, I think it's perfectly legitimate. You merge these different disciplines.
But you're no more an expert. So if I'm sitting down with a scientist and we're talking about abortion, mm-hmm. he or she is no more a ethical expert than I am, just because they've got a PhD in science.
Right. The information they could provide might be useful in making an ethical decision.
Right.
But they are not, an ethicist is going to know probably how to approach the ethics and morals of this better than someone who's just looking at the biology of it.
Gotcha.
And that's something that people often forget, that even scientists kind of, because scientists are people too. So we have these motivations and these drives and these values, which are all great.
And some expertise.
And
I mean, obviously,
yeah.
if you're really, really good in a particular area, you might presume that you're good in lots of different areas.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of a natural to have certain drives. And so someone who works in the field of stem cell research, may, because of what they're discovering and because of the potential that they see, to them it's just very, very imperative that certain stem cell research continues on. And so if someone questions that, they start, the knee-jerk reaction sometimes is, oh, you're questioning science.
Yeah.
Well, no, they're not questioning science. They have a
Right.
different ethical system perhaps than you do, and different values. So I think the only proper way really is to kind of go hand in hand with people of faith in kind of working out some of these difficult, a lot of these current event topics where you have ethical quandaries that come up as scientific technology develops.
And I've seen you do some of that. I've been to Trevecca when you were presenting a paper with the theology department.
Mm-hmm.
And that seemed to be a very helpful thing for these different disciplines to listen to each other and work together. And so you're in an environment where you get to do that some.
Yeah, I'm very fortunate because it's a small enough university where I get to hang around colleagues of all different disciplines and interact with and just interacting with students who of different majors, as I teach some of the early liberal arts general education courses.
Right.
that students of a lot of different majors have to take. And so just talking with students of different majors, just all sorts of conversations come up. And I've learned a lot, as I said before, from my colleagues, and even within just the science department, I've learned a lot. I came in, 10, 12 years ago, I was much more skeptical of certain theories in biology than I am today. And a lot of my acceptance of those theories is due to the fact that I have just had enough conversations with these biologists who I trust, and as they've given me more and more and more information, I've started to see, oh, that's why you believe that theory. Okay, well now that's making more sense to me.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things I recommend for Christians, really, that I think to have a healthy church, we need to engage people of science. And it's best if we can find scientists who are Christians to engage, but any scientists, I think it's useful to try to engage them for understanding in a friendly way,
Yeah.
not in this antagonistic way.
Yeah. Can I go back there for just a second? Because I'm thinking of all the conversations I've had as a pastor, and often I'll hear someone express some idea that in science it's all kind of hypothesis and can be easily overturned at any moment by some new discovery. Yes. But that's not true. That's not how science is done, is it?
Right. So one of the things that's very different from science than other disciplines is there is tremendous amount of consensus. And this is, I'd say, one of the biggest misconceptions out there among non-scientists, is that there is more controversy than there actually is.
Yeah.
So all of the controversy is generally around, and the debate is generally around the hypotheses. These are untested ideas that scientists are talking about, trying to understand, is this true, is this not? We don't have enough evidence to necessarily confirm. But there are many tried and true theories in science that there is tremendous consensus around.
And domains that fit together. I mean, these
Yes.
aren't just isolated pockets of information. This is a holistic.
A lot of things in science fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. So
Yeah.
you find that if you're looking at a particular theory in science, and you say, well, really need to replace that with a new. I don't like that theory. Maybe it's not correct. Well, whatever you find to go in its place has to have almost exactly the same shape, and it's got to have the same color shading to fit the rest of the picture, because everything's fitting together.
Right.
And so there's a tremendous amount of confidence that scientists have for their theories, not because, and it's mistaken oftentimes, I think, for hubris, for people outside the community. Oh, well, you're so confident about this theory because you're just arrogant.
Right.
Well, no, it's because everyone around me is seeing the same thing, and we're
Right.
coming to the same conclusion.
Right. Right.
And so this is something where, again, people who aren't in the room, and by the room I mean the scientific community, you're not seeing it, and so it's easy to say, well, wait a second, well, maybe you're all wrong, but if you step into the room, most all the time you start to see the same thing that everyone else sees.
Right. Right. And that's part of the reason that I wanted to do this second discussion, what I'm calling the meats and potatoes of science, is that there are just some really basic things here that that scientists do that are really not debatable.
No.
Yeah.
And
that have nothing to do with faith, that have nothing to do with some disproving of the Bible or faith or whatever. This is a discipline that's not even pretty well established. It is established.
Yeah.
There are areas that are still controversial, subatomic reality and questions.
Oh, there's a lot of things kind of on there's the core of science. So just, I think, similar to Christian faith, we can say what is the core of Christianity, and what's out on the periphery.
And what is room for disagreement.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I've run into non-Christians who think that believing in Christ is out on the periphery. It's like, no, that's pretty core in Christianity. But then other things like
whether he was risen from the dead is that's pretty central.
That's pretty central. But
how you baptize.
Maybe that's out on the periphery.
Or what the early church did about. I mean, that's a historical discussion.
Right.
Yeah.
But then in science, there's the same thing. There's the practices of science that are at the core. This is how we do science. And then there's these major theories that we've put into the core. And then there's out on the periphery all sorts of things, from string theory, which really is a hypothesis. It's not a theory. It's multiple universes. All this stuff is, this fascinating ideas out there.
Right.
But none of it is at the core of science.
Right.
But it's probably surprising to a lot of people what is at the core.
Right.
And even things that we say we overturn, like Newtonian physics. Well, Einstein's revolution in his understanding of the universe kind of overturned Newtonian physics, and yet I still teach Newtonian physics every year because it works.
It works in this
still
domain.
In the core. Yeah, it's still in the proper context, it is still absolutely true.
Yeah, and as a non-scientist, I often think about Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
Yeah.
What appears in this domain as I get smaller and smaller and smaller really is weird when we get down to the subatomic level. So, okay, well, I think that's helpful, just in trying to communicate to Christians this solidity that's there with science.
And one other thing that I was just thinking of also that's a common misconception is that there's an exclusivity in science, that we don't allow people in unless you agree with us.
Okay.
And that's something that really is a misconception. It's the same way, I think, in the church, that we have all sorts of you have all sorts of kooky people in your church, Phil, I know.
Present company excluded.
We allow, if people accept the core, then they can have some really strange ideas about other things.
Right.
They're not in a position of leadership in the church, but most churches are not, barring the doors unless you pass this test. You have to sign this document saying some churches are moved towards that direction, but that's the exception rather than the rule. And the same is true in science. But I've run into the misconception often that, they won't let me into the scientific community unless I adhere to all this stuff.
Yeah.
And that's why I won't jump through all the hoops of my education, because I don't, it's all just an indoctrination thing. But
no one has ever barred you in an academic context because you're a believer. You may be a quandary to them.
And there are weirder people than me out there. There's people who have all sorts of crazy ideas, and yet if they still do the science according to the rules, you still see them published. You still see them presenting at conferences.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how easy it is to participate in the scientific process if you just follow the basic rules.
Referring to Francis Collins again, I was reading a news article last week written by one of the major news organizations about him. And the respect for him is very deep in the scientific world.
Yes.
Very deep. And he will break out with his guitar and sing a song.
Yes.
And sing a song of faith or sing a song of science.
Right.
And everyone knows that he is a devout Christian.
Yes.
But it doesn't bar him from that
Absolutely not.
entry into the scientific world.
Yeah. He's the head of the National Institutes of Health right now, so he's one of the top scientists in the country. And there are top NASA scientists who are just very open in their faith and Christian belief. And there's nothing that I know of that really keeps people from participating.
We've got about 2 minutes left before we wrap this down. Is there anything else on this basic approach to science that you would like to communicate to Christians? I appreciate the idea about humility. I appreciate the solidity of it. Those are important things for us to know. Is there anything else that you would say before we wrap this up?
I just say that also the approach of science tends to be more of a bottom-up than a top-down approach. And I think oftentimes in faith we are approaching things more from a kind of a top-down.
Top-down. Yeah.
We have some general principles that we believe and some these core beliefs that kind of guide everything flows out of, but we aren't building those core beliefs through experimentation. And science is more of we're starting from the bottom up,
right,
and we're taking all the data and facts in order to build.
And that's a great picture. Our faith, as in the soft sciences, our faith is a revealed religion.
Yes.
Spoken to us by God.
Yes.
We didn't discover it by philosophy or science. It was revealed. Science is different.
Science is different.
Science is building from the ground up and building all the conclusions that scientists hold or we hold on previous foundations. Okay, that's helpful. Matthew, thank you. This is helpful, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Thanks.